Good evening. Welcome. Deborah Rogers is the founder of the Energy Policy Forum, a consultancy and education forum dedicated to policy and financial issues relating to shale oil and gas and renewable energy.
I really appreciate it. So, earlier this year in February, Energy Policy Forum issued a report called Shale and Wall Street: Was the Decline in Natural Gas Orchestrated? It is my contention that shales should have come unraveled. They're coming unraveled as we speak, believe it or not, but they should have come unraveled after the economic downturn, and they didn't. And the reason that they didn't is because a number of the large Wall Street investment banks, I call them the usual suspects, the Goldmans, the Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, etc., saw an opportunity to substitute essentially the fee generation that they had been getting off the mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, and other products. And they substituted shales for that. Shales then became the #1 profit center at these banks after the economic meltdown. And we're going to talk about that and then go into some of the reasons, some of the fundamentals. So essentially it was interesting what the banks did, at least to my mind. They basically used the same playbook that they had used with the mortgage-backed securities, the lead up to the mortgage-backed securities crisis. And that was used a lot of off-balance sheet financing. And the problem with that is that it creates problems for analysts or investors to really see what a company is doing and what their financials really are. If you have off-balance sheet financing, you can't really tell. And you may recall that Thomson Reuters broke the story on Chesapeake Energy, and it turned out that they had 1.1, actually it went up after that, but the initial reports were $1.1 billion in off-balance sheet financing that even the analysts who covered the stock on a day-to-day basis, many of them were completely unaware of this debt within the company. So it's a little bit of a problem. Also, you may recall that the banks, they took people from the ratings agencies and basically reverse engineered product so that it would pass the rating agencies and it would make it look like the product was much safer than it really was. And you can see here, I pulled this quote because it sort of encompassed everything down in one quote. This is an executive with Barclays Capital, and he's basically bragging. They won an award for a VPP deal for Chesapeake Energy, which is a volumetric production payment. It's a form of debt, essentially. Chesapeake would argue otherwise, but it's a form of debt. And as you can see, this executive readily admits that, and the other thing that they did in the lead up was they put people into financial instruments that they weren't qualified to be in. So have a look at this quote. He said, we had to get the structure right, and we guided the ratings agencies and institutional investors who did not necessarily have deep familiarity with the energy business through the complexities of natural gas production. It's a little bit of a problem for me. You may recall that in the lead up to the mortgage-backed securities crisis, they were bundling mortgages and then flipping them off and flipping them off again and again. Well, they essentially did the same thing this time with leases. Basically, as best I can tell, one of the primary differences is that with the mortgage-backed securities, the toxic assets were actually on the books of the banks, and that caused a problem because the banks are literally the bedrock, the financial bedrock of the world economic system. This time the banks wised up. They took the toxic assets and they moved and let the oil and gas companies keep those assets within their own books. But they were still encouraging and promoting the bundling of leases, and that's exactly what happened with shales. You may have heard different stories about lease prices in my neck of the woods. I live in Fort Worth, Texas, by the way, which is in the heart of the Barnett Shale. And in my neck of the woods, they literally drove up signing bonuses just to sign your land, give them the mineral rights to your land. They drove them up to $30,000 an acre at one point. This was right before the financial downturn. But here's Aubrey McClendon, CEO of Chesapeake Energy, saying he gave this quote, or he said this to some financial analysts in a call, and he said, "I can assure you that buying leases for X and selling them to 5 or 10 times X is a lot more profitable than trying to produce gas at $5 to $6. Well, they eventually drove gas down under $2. But shales was was and still is in some parts of the world, and we're seeing it now more in other parts, but it's a land grab. But it was basically essentially the same playbook, just instead of bundling mortgages, they were now bundling leases. So a lot of the mainstream financial press, when I first started talking about this, they said, oh, well, that's a very nice conspiracy theory, Deborah. And of course, the industry said the same thing. Well, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. I believe in math. And the math is actually very simple here. So don't think I'm going to throw some esoteric math at you. I'm not. This is actually quite simple. There's some primary metrics that analysts and investors use to assess the health of an oil and gas company. And one of those primary metrics is production growth. And when you listen, if you were to get on and listen to an analyst call transcript where the analysts all get on and they listen to the corporate management tell them, it's kind of their cheerleading rah-rah speech, the first thing those companies will tell these analysts is, you will be glad to know that we grew production X percentage year over year. Because that is such a primary metric. So you can take the existing production, which is a number that anybody can Google and you can come up with it, and then you can add on these production targets. And the investment banks, the analysts, they put these production targets on these companies, and these companies will jump through all sorts of hoops in order to meet these targets, because if they don't, then the banks will downgrade their stock, and that gives them all sorts of problems raising monies in future. You want to keep that growth in your stock. You want to keep those analysts keen on your stock and keep them promoting it out in the field through their army of stockbrokers, basically. So you take existing production and you add on the production targets, because you know these companies are going to pretty much meet them. And that's going to give you some sort of significant number. Now, I identified this just casually back in 2010. I noticed where we were heading with the price of natural gas, because you take that number and then you take what is the current demand in the U.S., and you could see right off that demand wasn't anywhere near supply. So you were creating considerable surplus or a glut. When you have a glut, prices can go in one direction and one direction only, and that's down. And so it was obvious to me back at the beginning of 2010 that gas prices were going to tumble, and they were going to tumble fast. So it's not a conspiracy theory. It's actually simple math. So what did this tumbling of the price of gas do for the investment banks? Well, have a look. In 2008, when the price was around $8 an average per MCF, they did about $15 billion in M&A. But as that price started to plummet, the value of the deals went up. That equates to significant fees for the investment banks, very significant fees. And as I stated before, shales became the largest profit center at quite a number of these banks. Now, do I have a problem with investment banks making money off fees and doing deals? Of course not. I used to be a banker, and that's what you do, and that's what you're supposed to do, and it's a healthy part of our financial system. Here's what I have a problem with, though. Within months, literally within months, those same deals began to go sour. Now, there's no way, if you're doing proper due diligence, and I assure you that they were, there's no way that those bankers did not know that those underlying assets were problematic. So here's what's happened. We've had 2 rounds of massive write-downs in shales just since 2009. This is the latest round of write-downs, and I need to add some more boxes, except I started to do that last night, and then I realized I was going to cover up Marius Kloppers, and he's such a good-looking guy. So, but essentially, you can see these are pretty significant. And it seems to be gaining even more momentum, shall we say, because both Royal Dutch Shell and ExxonMobil just came out in the last month or so and announced significant write-downs even for them, even for that size of a company. Shell took $2 billion in write-downs, and Exxon took about a 60% hit to earnings from shale assets. So these assets are even impacting companies the size of Royal Dutch Shell and ExxonMobil. BHP Billiton, this is the CEO of BHP Billiton, by the way, they went in. BHP Billiton is a large Australian multinational. They went in and they bought all of Chesapeake's Fayetteville assets, and 18 months later, they literally had to write off over 50% of the purchase price. His shareholders were not very happy, let's put it that way. And Mr. Kloppers here had to give up his bonus in 2012. So, so I'm sure he wasn't very happy either. But as you can see, this is a little bit of a problem. So, frackonomics. Let's go into the fundamentals of fracking and what these companies and just natural gas and shale gas, unconventional gas, to begin with. Does everybody understand the difference, first of all, between unconventional and conventional gas, or shall I define it very briefly? Define it. Okay. Conventional gas is the old-fashioned type of gas well. Now, this is going to be a very simplistic definition, but it'll do. Essentially, you would do your geology, and you would hopefully identify a large sea or pool of gas or oil beneath the surface, and you would essentially drop your drill bit in, somewhat like a straw. That's very simplistic, but somewhat like a straw, and suck the gas or oil out, right? With shales, it's different. The technology, I have to give them credit for the technology. The technology is truly astonishing. I mean, it's like something from Hollywood. They can now go down with a vertical wellbore, and then when they hit the formation, which is just the shale strata, they go sideways. They literally turn. And this technology, if they wanted to, theoretically, they could probably do corkscrews and go around building. I know they can go around buildings because they've had to do it in Texas a few times because people didn't lease for other reasons. So, but it's truly astonishing technology. And then they send little explosives. They're about that big. And they send them down into the wellbore, and they perforate the steel pipe and casing, and they fracture, they explode the rock underground, and that releases the gas. Now, over time, those shales, because you know what shales look like, they're just kind of flat, you know, and they're like levels. As you pull that gas or oil out, those shales tend to collapse in on themselves. And that's when they go in and they do what they call refracking. You may hear industry talk about refracking. Now, they went in and they did refracking in a very big way in the Barnett in 2009. And you'll be very pleased to know that it didn't increase production in a meaningful way at all. It was just extraordinarily expensive. So industry likes to throw this out and talk about refracts and all this and how wonderful they are. They're not wonderful. They have not been able to make much money off of them. It sounds flashy, so they use it a lot. So let's go in and kind of look at shales and the fundamentals of shales. Oh, I didn't finish my definition, did I? Yes, I did. Unconventional is just basically horizontal drilling with the hydrofracture stimulation. Sorry. Okay, I do a lot of these, and sometimes I kind of just go. So, the first question I'd like to ask is, why are shales so hyped? Because I've never seen an investment in my 25 years in the investment world so hyped as shales. And I always tell people, I learned a long time ago that when the investment community is hyping something or a company is hyping something to this degree, look out. Start paying real attention because there's a reason for the hype. So I think shales are hyped for a couple of reasons, which we're going to go into in more detail in a moment. But what if I were to tell you that there are investments out there that are investing in core infrastructure projects with high gross margins, and the revenues are fixed for 20 to 25 years, and they're giving double-digit rates of return in this interest rate environment? Now that would, as an investor, that gets my attention, and it gets most investors' attention. What if I told you that the green economy or clean economy grew at 8.3% during the economic downturn? That also gets your attention. Well, let me tell you, it also gets the attention of the oil and gas industry. They know they are on the downward slope of hydrocarbon production. We don't have to sit up here and debate, will it happen next week or will it happen 100 years from now? The point is, they have a finite resource and it will happen at some point. And things are beginning to happen. These are actual deals that are being done. Pru Capital, GE, Warren Buffett, they're kind of quietly but behind the scenes pumping billions and billions of dollars into these large, mostly wind and solar, commercial scale wind and solar, but very large projects. And they're locking in double-digit rates of return in this interest rate environment. The job story. You know, industry likes to tell us all about jobs, and if you really pay attention, all of their jobs figures come from economic models. Now, anybody who's taken Economics 101 knows that economic models are only as good as their inputs. You can skew a model, you can reverse engineer it, you can do all sorts of things by just changing the inputs, and you can make that model say anything you want it to say. So in their case, they start telling you about, we're going to create 600,000 jobs, and now I think it's up to like 2.3 million. Not really, they're getting a little bit drunken on their own PR, but anyway, we went in and did some work, as did others, and it was very interesting what we found. When you start parsing out these jobs, they do what they call indirect jobs, and they use a multiplier. So they say, we have this number of direct jobs, and then we're going to use a multiplier, and that's going to create indirect jobs, and that's where they get these huge figures, okay? But what we did was, and others, we went in and we parsed out the jobs that they were counting, and no kidding, the oil and gas industry in those glowing jobs reports are counting jobs like strippers and prostitutes in the mix. Now, admittedly, that's job creation, right? But it's not the sort of job creation that you or I think of when we hear, President Obama stand up in the State of the Union address and say we're going to create 600,000 jobs. I bet Obama doesn't know that it includes strippers and prostitutes. I don't know, who knows, maybe he does. So what I did, because I don't like to use economic models, sometimes they have a place. They can be good. Sometimes you have to use them because you don't have anything else. You're trying to extrapolate into the future and see. However, in this case, I don't think we need them. And this is the reason why. I went into the Bureau of Labor Statistics and I pulled the direct industry jobs. These are just the people employed directly in oil and gas. Now, this isn't just for shales or unconventionals. This is for all oil and gas, onshore and offshore. So the direct industry jobs are 181,000. Then I went in and I pulled from the BLS, and I just looked at wind, solar, and geothermal, just those three. There are other renewables, but I just took the big three. And they have approximately 183,000. So the jobs are about the same. But here's what, you can't just stop with numbers. You have to kind of flesh out the entire picture, because you have to look and see what percentage of electricity generation capacity does oil and gas provide. It turns out they provide 45% of our electricity generation, whereas renewables are only providing about 15%. And actually that number's a little bit high. It's really about 11, but if you stretch it, let's say 15, okay? As you can see, renewables, or that clean economy, are providing significantly more jobs per kilowatt. And that's really where that's where oil and gas really goes. If you take transportation fuels out, it's for electricity generation. They're creating significantly more jobs per kilowatt than oil and gas. I can assure you that is not lost on the oil and gas industry, and that is why every 5 minutes you turn on your television and you're hit with how many jobs the oil and gas industry is creating today. Now, if these companies, if this was truly an energy revolution, and this was game-changing, and this was going to go on for decades and decades to come. I love that phrase. They all use it, and now I use it all the time too. Shale is supposed to last decades and decades to come. If that were the case, then these companies ought to be healthy, shouldn't they? Because we keep hearing how they're producing gas and it's at record quantities, and it is, and we'll go into why that is in just a moment. But they should be healthy. They should be making money hand over fist, and they're not. One of the reasons that I use free cash flow, we're going to talk about free cash flow, and don't worry, you're going to understand this even if you don't have a business background. One of the reasons I use free cash flow instead of cash flow is that anybody who's an accountant in here or has taken accounting knows that you can do all sorts of very interesting things with cash flow. Free cash flow is a little bit harder to fudge. I'm not saying it can't be fudged, but it's much more difficult. You can't use as many creative combinations, let's say. So let's look at, I took a universe of 5 shale companies, and I took these companies because, for 2 reasons. They are almost exclusively just in shales. There's no offshore operations, so you don't have to muddy the waters like it would be very difficult to figure out with Shell or Exxon, because they have so many other types of operations other than just shales. These companies basically just do shales. In addition, they're onshore, and I picked them because they were in different shale plays, so that someone couldn't come back to me and say, well, that's true for the Barnett, but it's not true for the Bakken. Yeah, it is. So let's look at this. This is their capital expenditure. In red, this is how much money these just five shale companies have spent $56 billion in capital expenditure since 2010. This is how much money they've made in free cash flow. It's negative. In fact, it's worse than negative. As you can see, it's dropping each year. It's getting worse and worse. So they haven't even made $1 for $56 billion in capital expenditure. In fact, they're losing significant monies. This is Chesapeake here, and this is interesting because in here, Chesapeake has sold about $15 billion in assets, and it hadn't helped. They're not making any money. So there's a little bit of a problem there. So what are some other fundamentals that are going on here? Well, this is something that a lot of people don't know. Believe it or not, the majors have been struggling. The majors have not been able to, and by the majors, I'm talking about the big boys, the really big boys, the Shells, the BPs, the ConocoPhillips. They have not been able to grow production in a meaningful way, or grow reserve replacement in a meaningful way in over a decade. In fact, ExxonMobil in 2012 announced their reserve replacement ratio, and let me very briefly go into what that is. Basically, if you're an oil and gas company, you remember we talked about the primary metrics? Well, this is another one. You want to be able to show that the production that you're selling off, because you have a finite resource, the production that you're selling off, you're replacing. And you want to show that you're replacing a little bit more, hopefully, than what was sold off and used up. So ExxonMobil, for 2012, down in the fine print, admitted that 40% of their reserve replacement was coming from 2 shale plays, one of which is the Woodford, which has 2 rigs operating at the moment. The Woodford's done. It's over, basically. And the other is the Bakken. And the Bakken, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Bakken here in a moment, but the Bakken, you hear a lot about the Bakken. Industry is very keen on, sorry, my nose tickles. Industry is very keen on the Bakken at the moment because it's shale oil. I'll go into that. In fact, I came out in 2010, somebody asked me about shale oil when they first announced they were going to do it, and I said, here's what I think. I'm a girl, so I can say this. Shale oil is a shale gas makeover. It's the same girl, different shade of lipstick. And I was right. So the majors have been struggling, and they're not able, they're relying pretty heavily now, apparently, much more heavily than even I thought and some of my colleagues, because I didn't believe what I read, and I sent it off to some geologist friends, and I said, did I read this correctly? And they were like, oh my God, I had no idea that Exxon was counting that heavily on shales for reserve replacement. So you can see it's getting harder and harder to find hydrocarbons, and so now they're trying to convince us that what they've found in shales are cheap and abundant and are going to last us decades and decades to come, when in fact they're not. Recovery efficiencies. What that means is when in the old-fashioned conventional type of wells, you could, like I said, you'd do your geology, you would identify your sea or pool of gas, and you could put the drill bit in, and you would recover typically 75 to 80% of what was down there, gas or oil in place. With shales, it's averaging 6.5%. So when Terry Engelder gets up and talks about the gazillion, quadrillion feet of natural gas in the Marcellus, ask him about that 6.5% of it that he's going to get out. Energy return on energy invested. This is another thing. Hydrocarbons are not cheap and easy to find anymore, in spite of what they're telling us about shales. This is a simple ratio that the industry uses and other scientific entities use to determine how much energy have we expended in order to get energy out. And so in the early days of crude, you would expend about 1 barrel of crude to get 100 barrels out. That's what that 100 to 1 means. Today, you expend about 1 barrel to get 11 barrels of crude out, and this includes offshore and so forth. Tar sands, 1 to get 3 barrels out. Shales, we're still doing the work on it, but it looks like it's going to come in at about 4 to 5 to 1. So these are not efficient fuels to pull out of the ground. We're having to expend an enormous amount of energy itself just to get this stuff out of the ground. And that's a problem. at some point, if not now. Externalities, there are quite a few externalities. We're still working on some of these, but this one, I love these. They're kind of my favorite. Road damages. Industry loves to talk about severance tax revenue and that they pay billions and hundreds of millions of dollars in severance taxes. Severance taxes, or in Pennsylvania what they call impact fee, it's basically the same thing. It's the tax that a state levies on the extraction of the minerals. And industry does indeed pay a fair amount of money. But as you can see, and these figures are taken from the state comptrollers and the State Department of Transportation's. As you can see, in Texas, and this is for all onshore and offshore oil and gas in Texas, we took in $3.6 billion, but our road damage just from shales in the Eagle Ford, the Barnett, and the Permian, and the Haynesville, are estimated to be $4 billion. Pennsylvania has taken in $204 million. Pennsylvania made a huge mistake by not implementing a severance tax at the beginning. That their leadership really made an enormous mistake. They now, just to maintain the roads, $3.5 billion. PennDOT estimates that to actually do the roads properly and replace what needs to be done, $7 billion. The same thing in the Bakken. I don't have that box up. I've made a new slide, but I didn't. It's not quite finished yet. Same thing in the Bakken. I believe they've taken in $3.5 billion in severance tax since 2010, and it's $7 billion estimated road damage. Arkansas, $182 million. This is cumulative since 2009 that the state of Arkansas has gotten, and they estimate their road damage at $450 million. Now, that means that the local communities, A, have to live with very bad roads, and B, that those costs are being passed off onto the taxpayers. So that's wrong. These companies are essentially privatizing profits and socializing costs. That's not right. They tore these roads up, they need to fix them. Here, well, there's North Dakota right there. Sorry. As I said, it's not quite finished. But anyway, another interesting aspect of this, lack of confidence. There's a lack of confidence, believe it or not, within the industry itself. You saw up here in the Marcellus, Norse Energy put their Marcellus leases up for sale at in December of 2011, and they were supposed to have some of the best leases in New York State, and by the end December of 2012, a year later, nobody had picked them up. Nobody wanted them. So nobody within the industry was willing to step in and pick those leases up. Norse ended up declaring bankruptcy. Anschutz, as you I'm sure well know, they just let their leases go. But my favorite one is in the Bakken, because it involves a company that was proposing to build a crude pipeline. Now, pipelines are interesting entities because they're very expensive to buy, to build. But once you've built them and you recoup your initial costs, as long as you have a hydrocarbon there that will run for decades and decades to come, as they do in conventional fields, you have a cash cow on your hands. I mean, those things are money makers. They're just like money printers. And Wonock is the company, and they tried to put together a few investors to go in and build a pipeline out of the Bakken, and nobody would go in on it with them. Now, you have to wonder why, and it was interesting. I wrote a post about this, and it got picked up by a lot of industry publications and republished. And I don't think there's any doubt about what happened. Industry knows, in spite of all the public rhetoric and the hoo-ha and rah-rah stuff, they know that the Bakken wells are depleting so rapidly. By the way, we've looked at all the shale production on every shale well. The Post-Carbon Institute has done this. On all 65,000 shale wells, oil or gas in this country, and based on actual production, not projections or what industries, but based on what the wells are actually doing, the Bakken wells are played out by year 6. They're done. They're finished. All shale plays in the U.S. will be at stripper well status, or in other words, they will need to be abandoned, plugged, by 2024. This is not a long-lived exercise. But this pipeline, so they couldn't get other people within other companies within the industry to go in and put the monies up for this pipeline, because I think they knew it's not going to be long-lived enough. We're not going to be able to recoup our upfront costs in time. And so industry decided they would ship the crude by rail. Shipping crude by rail costs 3 times what it costs to ship crude by a pipeline. And the industry put a huge spin on it. It was a great public relations exercise, very funny to read. But anyway, that's what they're doing. And they decided not to do the pipeline because they could not raise the money within their own rank and file. Exportation. Exportation is being pursued to save ailing balance sheets, basically. It's very simple math. Once again, you have the domestic price at about $3.50 for the exact same amount of gas. For a long-term contract to China, you can get paid as much as 18. That's an enormous spread. You can extract it, pipe it, refine it, and ship it to Asia for all-inclusive cost of about $9 and get paid as much as 18. Now, if you're an oil and gas company, you're in the business, quite rightly, to extract hydrocarbons and get them to the client that will pay the most money. And in this case, that's Asia. And that's why shale exportation is being pursued. It is not going to give us energy independence. It can't give us energy independence. We are the global energy markets. We spent the last 40 years trying to globalize and make these markets global. And now we're just going to pull out? No, that isn't going to happen. And we can't. But what we are going to do, and this is what I testified before the Senate committee about, that I find very, very problematic. 2 things. We're locking ourselves into long-term contracts on a commodity that we know now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, because we can look at enough well production history, we know that these wells deplete at alarming rates. So we're locking the U.S. into, we're saying we are going to give China or Japan this gas for the next 20 years, and we got to come up with it come hell or high water. And it doesn't, and it's on a commodity that depletes very rapidly. That's the first thing. Second thing is that history tells us, and economic history is replete with examples of this, that if you will make more money taking any natural resource a country has, you will make more money by taking your own natural resource and turning it into a finished product and exporting that than exporting your natural resource. In fact, that ends up giving an odd economic outcome, actually, which is called the resource curse. And it ends up impoverishing areas rather than enriching areas where resource extraction takes place. Pennsylvania, I think rural Pennsylvania is a classic example of that, as is rural Texas. But that is why shale exportation is being pursued. It is not being pursued, this whole business of wrapping ourselves in a red, white, and blue flag, and it is just nonsense. Even industry insiders are uncertain about shale and its future. This is a quote from Lee Raymond, who was the former CEO of ExxonMobil, and he says, "You have to test whether or not the resource base is sufficient. I'm not sure we have enough experience with shale gas to make the kind of judgment you have to make," and that's my point entirely. We are locking ourselves into long-term contracts on a commodity that depletes very rapidly, and it doesn't look like the resource base is going to be sufficient. And then John Hofmeister, to sustain growth, companies will need to drill many wells at a rate far beyond the capacity of the industry at present. And that's the truth. If you look at what you would have to, the number of wells that would have to be drilled, basically Post Carbon ran these numbers and found that in the Marcellus, and I hope I'm going to get these numbers right because I'm doing this off the top of my head, but in the Marcellus, you basically need to drill something like, I think it's like 600 wells a month just to keep production growing. Just to keep it flat, you need 7,000 wells. That can't be right. You need 7,000 wells for the U.S., excuse me, at a cost of $42 billion per annum just to keep shale production flat. The industry can't drill that many at present. They don't have the capacity, and that's what Hofmeister is talking about. But that's what it's going to take. By the way, almost every shale play in the U.S. is already in decline. I don't know if you know that. The Marcellus peaked about 6 months ago, maybe 7 months ago, and it plateaued, and that's the sign that it's about to go down. And I bet if we go back and look at the numbers now, you'll start seeing that it's in decline. The Barnett, the Fayetteville, the Haynesville, the Bakken. The Bakken's interesting because it's their poster child. The Bakken per well production peaked in June of 2010, 3 years ago. Now they have more than doubled the number of wells in the Bakken since that time. And see, this is the treadmill that we talk about, because just to keep it looking like shale is this great game changer, they have to go engage in a frenzy of drilling. And eventually that catches up with them, because the older wells deplete so quickly that it doesn't matter how many new wells they bring online, they can't keep up with the decline in the older wells. So when you hear industry say, well, the Bakken production's been moving up, well, yes, it has, but it hasn't been moving up in per well production. And that's really what you need to look at. And the only reason it's moved up, if you just say the production has moved up, is because they've added considerably more. They've more than doubled the number of wells. But if you look at per well production, it's going in the opposite direction. This is a classic example. This is my hometown. This is a classic example of this. In 2008, the city of Fort Worth told us we were all going to be shale-yonaires. I'm not kidding. Shale-yonaires. Mailbox money, they called it. And they did indeed take in $50 million in gas drilling revenues off 44 wells. And it did appear that we were going to be shale-yonaires to most people. But by 2012, this number, and by the way, it had dropped pretty steadily the entire time. This number was down to 23 million. Only now we have 400 wells. So the number of wells increased tenfold and the revenues fell. I can give you example after example after example after example of this very thing. And you pick a play, any play, and I'll give you an example. That's the problem with shales. So if you're counting on long-term revenue generation from this, it isn't going to happen. In fact, in early 2013, back in January or February, a reporter called me because he had sat in on a city council meeting, like a closed, it was a small session. I don't know, it couldn't have been closed, but he sat in on it. And he said the city manager got up and told them, he said, the Barnett's done. Don't count on the monies from the Barnett anymore. Now, the Barnett was supposed to go on for 40 or 50 years, they told us. It only got started in earnest in 2006, and by 2013, it's done. So, shales are not long-lived. You were talking about, Senator Hoylman mentioned about greenhouse gas emissions. This, I'm going to conclude very quickly with these couple of slides because I think it's quite astonishing. Methane, as you may or may not know, is considerably more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. It doesn't last as long in the atmosphere, but it's more potent. And this, because they drove the price, with this frenzy of drilling, they drove the price of natural gas down. Natural gas isn't even worth their while anymore. And so in the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, which are their two, oil plays, they're just flaring a lot of this gas off. And this is what the flares look like in the middle of a cow pasture at night on a Google map. Those are nothing but natural gas being burned off into the atmosphere. Now, flaring is an antiquated process. They should never flare. They don't have to flare. Most first world countries don't allow it. It's banned in most first world countries. They don't need to do it. They do it because it's cheap. And they're doing it here because they just don't care. They just want to get the oil out and they don't care about the gas. Now that is our natural resource that's just going up in flames. But the other problem with flaring is that in the field, and this has been peer-reviewed and tested and so forth, in the field, flares run at about 65%, if you're lucky, efficiency. Industry will tell you, oh, well, it burns off 99% of the gas in a lab, not in the field. Stroesher did an amazing study for the Canadian government, which has been adopted by most first world countries back in 1999, and he worked on this very thing, and he found that benzene was still at quantifiable levels from a natural gas flare as much as 5 kilometers, 3.5 miles downwind. and that's a known human carcinogen. So this is, I keep doing that. This is just flares. That's just wasting our natural gas. Industry is flaring enough gas to power all the homes in Chicago and Washington for a year. Here's the Eagle Ford. You can see that crescent shape, and those are the cities of Austin and San Antonio. Again, the Eagle Ford's out in the middle of nowhere. So we have become one of the worst offenders for gas flaring, and the amount that we're burning off has tripled in the last 5 years, according to the World Bank. So, from a climate perspective, that is highly problematic, not to mention all the fugitive emissions coming from the wells.
But I wanted to start off, Deborah.
Okay.
First, thank you again. Fascinating. And your graphics look great on this screen, by the way. On the issue of the critics, what can we say to rebut them? What is their typical response to your presentation, and what do you say back?
Interestingly enough, the industry doesn't like me. But they have, with one exception, which Energy in Depth did about, I don't know, a year or so ago, and it was very, very poorly done. They have never taken on my work. And I think the reason that they don't do it is because I pull all of this from their own 10Ks. And it's a little bit hard when you're using a company's numbers against them, or I pull it from their own production histories filed with the state. So if they want to take umbrage with that, then they're basically admitting to fraud. And so it's been interesting to me because the only, basically the bulk of the criticism from industry against me has been personal attacks. She's a goat farmer. She's an ex-model. Like, I'm supposed to be ashamed of that? Okay. Well, she's this, she's that. Funnily enough, I was sitting at dinner one night in Texas, and I had been on MSNBC the day before and talking about fracking, and apparently I upset Aubrey McClendon, so he asked to go on the next day. And he got on there and he started ranting and raving. Apparently, I didn't see it. I just got about 1 million emails and texts all of a sudden while I was eating. And it was very funny because apparently he got on there and he said, "Who are you going to believe, some goat farmer from Fort Worth or me?" And I thought, this is great. He just made me 1,000 times more famous than I ever should have been. I mean, it was just great. So it has been interesting. It's been all character assassination, but virtually no criticism of my work. The other thing I'm proud of is that they have been invited to be on panels with me, and they won't come anymore.
Wow.
I think that's...
And if I could just ask, yeah, if I could ask one more question. You know, when you showed the profits basically in the negative for the big petrochemical gas and oil companies, where are the shareholder lawsuits over this?
Well, there are some. Actually, there are. There are quite a number of class action suits, particularly against Chesapeake at the moment. There's some very interesting things happening. In fact, Trillium Asset Management, just yesterday, somebody sent me their press release, and they have now dumped all the stock in Range Resources because they said that Range was contemptuous, essentially, of the shareholders, of which they were one large institutional shareholder. So it is happening, and there are things like that going on.
Great.
Yeah.
Some questions now? Yes. Sir.
Grab my water here.
Okay, by the way, just a quick note. New York has no severance fees, so if, for whatever reason, fracking does get started here, we're going to be like Pennsylvania. They're just going to destroy our roads and the rest of the environment and not even pay for it like they do in every, in other states. At least they charge them. But, talking about, I think the main attraction of this presentation for a lot of people here is because here in New York City, just about everybody is against fracking. The concern I've got is that while it's wonderful to, to be opposed to fracking and to fight for the fracking ban, we got to think about what we're going to do instead. We have alternative technologies like ground source heat pumps that, according to Columbia, could heat and cool 800,000 of the buildings in New York City alone. And in this state, that's about 50% of our gas is used for residential purposes. The thing I don't understand is that when we have viable technologies like ground source heat pumps that can replace gas for heating and cooling for 50% of its use, why in the world aren't we focused more on replacing gas than simply trying to ban particular ways of obtaining it?
Well, that's a very good point. And I have to say, I mean, you can't just drop hydrocarbons overnight. We can't do that. We're too dependent upon them. My biggest concern is, and your question is very valid and I think a very good one, a very good point. My biggest concern is that we need to transition to more renewable sources of energy, and we need to be doing it now, and we need to be planning ahead for the future. And if we can use what natural gas we've got at the moment to help us transition into that, then I think that that's a much more stable way to handle the economy. But we most decidedly need to move into a new energy economy. Now, I think that there's, I like to tell people, because I think for a lot of us, we feel like, well, we just can't put, solar's not going to work and wind's not going to work. You hear that all the time. That's not necessarily true. It's getting more efficient. There's a company in Austin, Texas that part of the problem with solar, for instance, is the conversion rate. And it's typically, I believe, 10 to 15%. And they've got it up now using nanotechnology in the lab. They've got it up to like 75%. They have not been able to do it in the field, but I figure it's just a matter of time, and they'll work that out. But why aren't we spending money on that research and development? Why are we talking about spending literally billions and billions and billions of dollars to put in infrastructure for what is essentially a dying energy, which is hydrocarbons? And you're exactly right. We ought to be putting, utilizing what we've got to make this transition as smooth as possible. Now, this is just my personal opinion, and I'm sure some of you will disagree with me, but I want as stable a transition as we can possibly have. And it scares me to death to listen to industry, because they're advocating business as usual. Don't worry about it. Drive your SUVs. Run your air conditioners all the time. It's not a problem. Don't use your heat pumps. You're exactly right.
And Deborah, following up on that, in terms of green and clean energy, you indicate that actually more jobs are created.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting. I mean, if you really want to talk about job creation, then let's talk about job creation. I mean, let's look at the actual numbers. Those are direct industry numbers. People being employed directly by those industries, and it creates significantly more jobs. So why aren't we putting people to work, making a smoother transition away from hydrocarbons? That's where we ought to be.
Right. On the other side, is there a question along the... Yes, ma'am, in the red.
Flaring is essentially the gas is coming up out of the wellbore, and they set it on fire, and it makes a most impressive flame. It's about 20 to 30 feet tall. It is deafening loud, like a jet almost loud. I'll give you an example of that. I was 2/3 of a mile away outside my kitchen door of a natural gas flare, and using a sound meter, and the decibels were 80 at 2/3 of a mile away. It is deafening up near it. It's most impressive. I mean, it's this huge flame, and that's what I was talking about. It does not, industry will tell you that it burns off 98-99% of all the gas. It does not. They can create a flare in a laboratory and have those conditions. What Stroesher found in his extensive study of natural gas flares was that in the field, you were lucky if you got 65% burn efficiency off a natural gas flare, which meant that, yes, it was noxious. You are getting the benzene, you're getting which is the human carcinogen, 3.5 miles downwind. You get a lot of other stuff too. We were getting carbon disulfide, and that's now showing up in all the natural gas plays. In fact, that's what's causing the well, that and formaldehyde are causing the ozone problems. But carbon disulfide is a known neurotoxin, and like at my farm, we had it at 300 times what was normal for ambient urban air.
So I'm a little confused. Why are they burning it off?
Because it's cheap. What they'll tell you is we need to clean out the wellbore. And what they ought to be doing is what is called a green completion, which means you need a pipeline in place, and then you complete the well, you hook the pipeline up, and the gas goes through, and you don't have to, you can clean out the wellbore other ways, but the gas never escapes into the atmosphere. This way, it's just a cheap and easy way for them to do it, and they don't have to have a pipeline in place. And like in Texas, they were very, very frank with us. They said, if we had told you what the pipeline, how much disruption was going to come from the pipelines, you would never have let us drill to begin with. So they go in and drill, and then you can't stop them from disrupting everything to put in a pipeline, because they say, well, we've spent all this money now, we have all these wells, you have to let us hook them up. But in the meantime, they flare the gas off.
And another use of Google Maps, which I never knew.
Yeah.
Another question on this side. Anyone on this side for the question? Yes, yes, sir.
I have a couple. It's just derivative. On the way that the land is assessed as being the plays, the potential productivity, I understand it's rather complicated. I've read about it, and I'm not quite. And is the SEC pursuing any of these?
Yes.
Because I have Googled and I haven't found what's happening lately. That
Okay, let me start at the beginning. The industry went in, when I was talking about the land grab, what they did was they went in and let's say this stage is a natural gas field, okay? And they said, you know what, shale is so simple, it's a manufacturing model. That's actually what they called it. They said, we can drop the drill bit in anywhere in here and we're gonna get the same amount of gas. It's homogeneous. Turned out that wasn't the case at all. It's not homogeneous. Shale plays contract down to core areas just like conventional plays. In other words, you still get that somewhat, it's a little bit different animal, but it's still like that sea or pool of gas in some areas. They know that now. They go in and they drill those areas out first, makes it look like a brand new play is you know, just stupendously good, and then they have to move out into more marginal acreage. But what they did in the beginning was they would go in and they'd say, this whole thing is homogeneous. We're going to get, you know, millions and billions of cubic feet of gas out of here. And so they would drill up a handful of wells and they would pronounce it, you know, wonderful, and then they would flip those plays to kind of the next sucker. That's what happened to BHP Billiton. To give you an example of how much money these operators were able to make by in this game, they would go in and pay farmers typically in rural areas, maybe if they were lucky, $500 an acre, and they were flipping the same acreage at times for as much as $25,000. And so they were making a lot of money. And they proclaimed the whole field was proved up because they drilled a handful of wells, and it wasn't. So that was a bit of a problem, and that's part of these massive write-downs that you're seeing. That's part of it. Part of it is the decline in natural gas price. There are a number of factors going into this. But I'm going off on all these tangents. There's so many things. The SEC. The SEC went in and I pulled, in one of my presentations, I give examples of letters that the SEC has written to companies, and it's quite fun actually because they sound very pompous and very formal, but they basically say, gee, we're really sorry, but the numbers you've given us are mathematically impossible. And please amend your filing, and you know. And what they found was the SEC is always going to be quiet. They're never going to come out and make a big production of kind of slapping these companies on the wrist, because it's bad for business and it's bad for the stock market. So they do it quietly. But what I do know is that they no longer, the companies when they're giving their dog and pony shows for IPOs, the way I found this out is quite funny actually. A very good friend of mine, his son was out doing, and that's initial public offering, by the way, IPO. Sorry, I tend to just talk sometimes. And they were trying to raise monies, right? And on Friday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, the SEC called them and said, you have to amend all of your material by Monday morning, or we won't allow you to make any further requests for funds. meet with any further investors until you amend and say that these wells will no longer last 40 to 50 years, they'll last 20 at the most. They're also looking at, there's a formal investigation now of Chesapeake Energy, and the Department of Justice is also investigating Chesapeake, but they've upped it to a formal, the SEC has upped it to a formal investigation, and they're looking at well lives and how they come up with these figures, and the figures for the reserves. What we know now is these companies have they overestimated reserve, the total amount of gas coming from the wells. When they went out and raised the monies or told and made presentations to investors, they would tell them that the wells were averaging a certain, what they call EUR, which means estimated ultimate recovery. And we now know that the operators across the board have overestimated plays by a minimum of 100%, and some plays by as much as 400 to 500%. We know that from production history. And the problem with that is that the SEC changed the rules in 2009, and sorry, I hope I'm not boring everybody, but they changed the rules in 2009 for oil and gas. They allowed them to expand the definition of reserves, which in and of itself, there were good reasons for doing that, but it got taken advantage of, obviously. And suddenly companies, literally overnight when the rule went into place, companies like Petrohawk and Chesapeake, some of the more aggressive ones, their reserves jumped up as much as 200%, which made it look like their finding development costs had plummeted. That gets kind of technical.
So it's another kind of Halliburton rule.
Yeah. And but the funny thing is that when they changed these rules, the SEC and I went in and read every one of these letters. There were like 75 letters from industry to the SEC when they were getting ready to change the rule, and they put a lot of pressure on SEC they said, you got to love this. They said it's not cost effective for us to have independent auditing of reserves. It would just be prohibitively expensive for us. Now this is coming from companies like ExxonMobil that spend $5 billion a quarter just buying back their own shares. You know, the East Coast had all those wind farms offshore, that it would have dropped the wind speeds hitting land down to about 50 miles an hour, and there would have been significantly less damage. And EIA is the Energy Information Administration, part of DOE, and they're the forecasting arm. But EIA came out with these numbers and stated that the U.S. was going to be, the largest oil and gas producer in the world by, I think it's 2030, we're supposed to be. And we're well on our way now, and they gave all this forecasting. Okay. EIA does, not very many people know this, but they do a retrospective analysis of their own forecasting every year. It's very interesting because when you go in and try and pull up, like for 2011, it disappears immediately when they put the retrospective forecast for 2012, and the reason is because they're so bad at forecasting you can't even believe. So they've gotten the price of natural gas wrong consistently, because I've learned now you go ahead and print it all off so you have hard copies because it disappears off the website. But they're consistently wrong about the price of nat gas 76% of the time, I think. They're consistently wrong about the price of crude like 72% of the time. They're consistently wrong about the effect of crude prices on GDP 94% of the time, I think it is. I mean, they are so bad. It's not all their fault. They have to get their data from somewhere, and they get it from industry. And having just participated in this working group, I mean, I literally was on a call last week, the second of the last, there were 2 calls. And it was very interesting to me because they're doing these models, and they put no elasticity in the models. Now, that's getting kind of, but it's basically like, well, this could just go on a trajectory upward forever because they don't factor in anything like demand destruction. Like we know, for instance, in the United States, when the price of oil went up to about $125, $130 a barrel, we significantly cut consumption. So we now know that the US and Western Europe, that's it for us. That's the top where we can go, and then it really starts to impact our economy. And China can go up to about 140, and then China's priced out of the market. Those are very interesting statistics. If you look at EIA's numbers, they don't factor in any of that. So they just say, oh yeah, when the price of crude is 225, it's going, well, it ain't never going to get there because nobody's going to be there to buy it. So, so I'm sure that's where those numbers came from. And you just have to take them with, that was a long-winded, I'm sorry, that was a long-winded explanation to say that they suck at forecasting.
I'd just like to say one thing about the pipeline. The frack gas has a much higher level of radon than regular gas. Radon is the second highest cause of lung cancer. And I have to tell you that the New York State Breast Cancer Network that just presented a breast cancer and hydrofracking, we are terrified of all the chemicals because many of the chemicals are linked to breast cancer.